I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Arcane Mark, where today we are talking about GM tools, transportation, and vehicles. We will be talking about transportation in your game, vehicles in your game, mostly for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but also transportation as it applies just general in tabletop RPGs.
Yes. So when it comes to transportation methods that are available in your world go a long way toward establishing the way that your setting works. So a setting where, most people are going to have the farthest that they can possibly go be that how far they can go on foot, and then like some people might have a horse-drawn carriage, is a heck of a lot different from a setting where people can expect to travel between planets aboard starships. And
Yes.
Those methods of travel that are available to, people in general versus only people who have enough wealth or status to get them versus nobody at all are going to set things like what are the connections between groups in your setting. Are you going to have trade routes that are building? What is that going to mean for the access that people may have to certain different kinds of resources? How is that going to shape the military history of your setting? How is that going to shape how easy it is for the PCs to get access to magic items, something that they care about?
Magic items, the only things they care about.
Look, PCs care about loot, okay? And magic item access and things like that. So thinking about how those things, what you're going to want to give access to, both from the perspective of like, what do you want to have in the world because of the setting? And then also, how does what you give the PCs influence the kind of adventure that they're having? So if you're doing something, just on the base level of like your transportation is, how far can you walk? That's going to be, PCs are fairly early on going to get access to, okay, how far can we walk? And also like, can we take a horse or what have you? Those are some of the more common ones that you're going to have in the RPG. And so like, you're going to need to think about, okay, well, if you're limited based on what you can walk to, and there's something that's in a city that's 10 days travel away, that's not going to be a solution for your proximal problems. You're going to need to find problems that are closer to home. It also means when transportation is more limited, that also helps to explain why the PCs. Why aren't other people coming in and solving this for them? If the PCs are in a remote town and it would take a week for the city guard to get there and help solve the problem, and by that time the town is going to be overrun, that explains why they have to solve it.
Whereas if they're Uber airships that can get to anywhere in the entire world within a day, that's different. And if there's spaceships that can get anywhere in the entire galaxy in 10 minutes or less, then that's also very different.
So it's not just that the PCs have access to more resources, it's that there's more people who might come in and solve the problem too.
Yes. And there are different kinds of stories you can tell. If you want to do a long distance chase and you have a warp speed that can go like almost an arbitrary amount of distance in space, people will rightfully mock you for making no sense when you have that chase, especially if you send someone off to the side to go to another planet, do a side quest, and then come back to the ships that they were on that were in the middle of that chase.
What an oddly specific example.
Yes, but it's an example that speaks directly to the heart of the topic of this episode of transportation and vehicles, because it was a movie that wanted to tell a chase story that they could not tell because of the vehicles that were in there without looking absolutely like it made no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, for sure. Another important thing to consider with the methods of transportation is also like how flexible they are. Because you're going to have certain methods of transportation that many of them are going to be more like, oh yeah, you can go wherever you want. Then there's others that are, like, if you're walking, you can walk anywhere that your feet can take you. But then if you have some where it's like, okay, yeah, well, actually, no, there's a mountain range. And so that's going to create some challenges for getting across that. And then you'll have some that are very much based on taking certain paths. So like, we need our cart to follow the roads. So that's going to limit where we go, or we need like our train to follow the tracks, or even we need, you know, our teleport gate that goes from point A to point B is going to go in a defined path, versus if you had something like, you know, the flying mount or the airship or something like that can go anywhere. So when you have something that is speed between points but not 100% flexible, that has a very different impact on the adventure too. So you can say, all right, you know, it's fast to get from point A to point B in the town, but now we're doing an adventure that's more remote. So you can have an adventure where usually you have access to more resources, but in this specific case, because you don't, oh, you know, the swamp is too muggy, we can't take our horses, we can't take any of the other things, we need to go on foot. That changes the feel of the adventure when you shift up the expectations.
That makes sense. And it's definitely true. You want to know how far the PCs can go. You want to know what type of terrain the PCs can move through in their transportation. And sometimes, like, maybe it only matters in an abstraction, depending on what game you're playing. For example, in the tabletop RPG Fabula Ultima, the measure of distance to something is travel days. And you just arbitrarily decide when you make the world map how far, like, with your fingers or, like, with inches is a travel day. And that determines what the vehicle or chocobo or whatever you're riding on speed is. And it can be whatever you want it to be. It could just mean that the world is ridiculously small. You don't even measure it in miles there. In many tabletop RPGs that try to go a little bit more nitty-gritty, like Pathfinder or D&D, they're going to use mile distances, and then you have a speed that gives you the number of miles per hour or miles per day that you can travel, and that are usually generally based off of human ability to walk or run or jog, and then horse movement and other actual
ships
vehicles.
Actually move, that sort of thing.
Yes, they're usually loosely based off of reality, at least in terms of how fast things can move. And so that's very important for vehicles when they're used for transportation for long-term exploration speed, because it tells you, like Linda said, how far apart places really are from each other.
So I want to get into something that Rohit's saying here. I like the vehicles that can present perils, like an airship that can fall down or a ship that can sink. And then Kitsune Warlock says there's more than distance to account for with travel. Absolutely. So there's things like, you know, how is the transport powered? Is this something that's powered by, like, you're walking or you're rowing the ship or things like that? Does it have horses? Does it have fuel? How is the transport maintained?
What types of terrain can
the transport go across? And what kinds of threats are going to target it specifically? So, you know, if you have a transport that if you are, you know, taking a horse-drawn wagon, then the fact that there are horse thieves in the area may be relevant to you. If you are...
Or the fact that goblins don't like horses.
Or the fact that goblins don't like horses. If you are, you know, if you're taking a train, and the train needs a certain kind of fuel, or like your starship needs fuel, and then you need to gain that.
If you're taking the train somewhere, then your players will be like, you've railroaded us onto this exact path that we're traveling. Because literally there's railroad tracks that are in front of them, and they can't take the train anywhere other than on those tracks.
There you go. Yeah, well, that's what we were saying before about, like, how some of the methods of travel have more defined paths. And then, you know, depending upon the size of the transport that they're using, that's going to have impacts on what happens when something does go wrong. So, you know, if you're on foot or you're on a horse or something like that, maybe you're using a more conventional battle map for that. If you're on, like, a cart, but if you're on, like, a ship or, like, a starship or something like that,
then it's its own encounter area.
It's going to be its own encounter area. And you may, for some of those middle-sized ones, have ones where you have a thing that has its own squares that is moving across a map. And then you've got, like, this giant miniature or something that's representing that, or like another tile that you're moving relative to the surrounding area.
You can wind up with an entire boat map that is essentially a mini map that is moving on the larger map, while, like, a Kraken monster is, like, attacking from the side of the boat, and there's, like, Sahuagin who leapt up onto the boat and are on the boat with the PCs moving along when the boat moves along. And you can have a lot of complicated things that are going on when you add vehicles in.
Yeah, you can have sort of larger, more zoomed out maps that are more about describing the the relationship in space between various things. Well, literal space, like,
in
with the
space.
Starship combat, you're not you've got those hexes, and those hexes aren't counting like a specific number of feet in the same way. They're more like, okay, this is how many Starship hexes you are apart. But then if you come close and you board, then you use a different kind of map. So mixing, but even if you're not doing that, like that's a great example of how you can sort of mix systems like that. But you can have things where like, oh yeah, we're doing a vehicle chase, or we're doing like a naval combat or something like that, and then we move into that closer sphere.
I'm trying to do some quick math, but I think that the thing I'm about to say actually won't be true, but it might be, so I'll say it now, which is, those of you watching from YouTube, one strategy you could use if you wanted to do like a naval combat or an airship combat or something like that in your Pathfinder 2 game is use Starship Combat from Starfinder 2nd Edition, a game that may be out by now when you're watching this video as it came up.
That's true, because I'm currently working on...
I was trying to do the math,
because I'm working my way through the 2020 and 2021 videos right now, so by the time I get to the 2023 videos, Starfinder 2 should be out.
Yep. So that's what I'm thinking. So it's possible that you could use that solution and have just whatever the Starfinder 2 answer is. Just you make some changes, maybe change the whatever computer readings options there are into like magic prediction spells to find where enemies are, and you'll be set for that. It looks like Miss Roy was thinking of the same thing.
Yeah, that'll be awesome. I really love how much flexibility that's going to give to GMs to mine systems for content and do cool crossovers and stuff
Tabletop
like that.
Obscura is going to do the same thing. Everybody's thinking it. Well, I did talk about it in the Roll for Combat Live episode too, and people were asking it, so it's already on people's mind. Now, let's say you don't have a Starfinder 2nd Edition Starship Combat option, but you want to have vehicles in there. And some of your players are not using vehicles, and other people are using vehicles. So there are vehicle rules that are in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and they're very workable in that they allow you to have a vehicle. The one thing about it is some of those vehicles are like kind of fast. Most of them aren't ridiculously fast, so that you can actually use them on the battle maps with the rest of your PCs. But the ones that start getting fast, it's just like the maps in your adventure path or that everyone else is using may be too small for the vehicles. They may be able to drive all the way off and then kite with long range abilities. That's partially why, like, the idea is when you're on a vehicle, your accuracy goes down by a lot when you're trying to attack things that are not on vehicles.
But if they're not on vehicles, if you're fighting like vehicle versus not vehicle, you're probably going to want to do something where you zoom the scale out. So like, let's say for example that you are all in a giant armored tank and you're trying to defeat a Godzilla monster, right?
Yes.
So like you can do a map where
in that case, the Starship Combat style like abstraction will work great.
Yeah, exactly. So you're using like that kind of abstraction, but also you can have something where you zoom out the scale of the map, because if everything on the map is, some of the trouble that you get into with maps is when it's like, oh, right, but like there's some things that need 5-foot squares, but then there's some things that are giant. What do I do? Whereas if like the smallest thing you're dealing with is a 20-foot square, then you can abstract and say 1 square equals 20 feet. And then you've got your map and you can say, all right, well, you're moving really fast, but this map can contain it.
Yes, and you could even make 1 square just be like, well, you know what? The Godzilla has a tail that can hit things up to 100 feet away, and the tanks got several kinds of it's a magic tank. It's got several kinds of things it can do. And it's got a 100-foot magic missile multi-cannon thing that shoots off like 100 magic missiles. And then it's got a longer range fireball launcher that shoots the giant fireball up to 500 feet. And you could be like, well, a square is 100 feet. So when you're there, if you're in the same square, then Godzilla can use its bite. But Godzilla's tail and its 100-foot laser and its 100-foot tail could be from 1 space away in the magic missile launcher, and 5 spaces away is when you can shoot the fireball.
And you may even be able to do something where you just use a simpler scale of like total distance. Like if you don't have AoEs other than like, Godzilla has big bursts around them or something like that, you know, you could do something like that, or like, you know, zones of combat where it's like you're in the same zone, or you're one zone away, or you're two zones away, and what does that mean for the kinds of attacks that you can use?
And it looks like Tony says teleportation in space seems like it should be hard. Arguably, it would be very difficult based on the Pathfinder rules for teleportation. If I recall correctly, even in PF1, the edition where casters could basically do almost anything, you would need to have gotten it into the realms of like a wish that your GM was on the spellcaster's side in order to defeat someone who was just in a spaceship going very fast constantly, because no matter what you did, they would be so far away that none of your spells would hit them, except for like a couple things that hit
and then
anything
there was,
on
like,
the same plane.
Interplanetary teleport, but
yes,
then that had certain things that didn't work when you were talking about it, because you didn't have
it was 9th level.
Yeah.
And we're assuming you could cast whatever you want. It can go very far, but you need to know exactly where they're at.
And then by the time you assess the ship's location,
by the time you assess their
faster.
location, unless you had a wish that the GM was being nice and was just like, okay, I'm going to say that you know exactly where they are, or maybe transport travelers. Like, short of wish, you just weren't going to be able to get onto their spaceship, or to a distance such that you could shoot their spaceship, because it was just moving too fast.
I mean, that's sort of like the most extreme end of the scale. But in general, like, if you have one group that's moving so much faster than the other, it can, like we were saying before, just completely break the encounter. So if you have those kinds of speeds, you're going to want to make sure that the different sides in the combat have an ability to move, and also have an ability move fast enough to be relevant to that, or at the very least to have attacks with a long enough range that can do things like pulling in, or guarding, or things like that, to prevent those kinds of, like, I'm going to go outside of the range, and I'm gonna come into the range, and I'm gonna attack, and then I'm gonna go back, or I'm gonna just stay outside of the range and attack, because then you don't really have a combat, you just have a one-sided beatdown.
Yep. And Tabletop Obscura looks like in their pirate campaign, is it Indigo Isles? Two of the Indigo Isles, they use chase mechanics when you're really far away, then vehicle mechanics with 30-foot squares until they get into boarding range, which is 5-foot squares.
That sounds like an awesome idea. I really like that mix. And chase mechanics are very, very flexible, so you can easily have them be like, oh yeah, you know, this represents where the ship is throwing down, like, you know, all sorts of stuff over the side to try to mess up your ship, or like there's like this kind of attack that's going on, and so it's slowing you down, or they're like having their spellcasters aboard like use wind to try to drive you off course, and you have to try to find your way against that, and don't have people fall off the sides and that sort of thing, and then you get close enough and you battle.
Absolutely. People in chat are still interesting about the idea of trying to get to a moving starship and hit it on target. Yes, it was very difficult. It basically meant that I believe that short of using a wish to transport travelers or something of that similar ilk, nobody who
When were we talking about this? Was this?
It was like who would win first level Starfinder characters who were able to just shoot their space weapons. Or it wasn't Starfinder characters even. It was Pathfinder 1 Androphans. Rather, it was even before Starfinder existed.
Oh yeah,
first level Pathfinder 1 Androphans, who were like first level and were just in a ship that was moving very quickly and could fire off their ship weapons at ranges that were far longer than
versus
long
super
range.
High level PC
versus very high level spellcasters who did not have access to wish.
And it was like, yeah, the Androphans are gonna win.
And the Androphans, we think probably would win unless your
GM
let you use some weird cheesy auto win tactic that was like, yes, and I painted a picture of a monster that also had wish and therefore gained wish and unlimited numbers of things, and I filled the universe with an infinite number of creatures, so the Androphans couldn't move because the universe was filled with the creatures I created.
There you go.
Oh boy.
But
Today Warlock says first level vigilante magical girl with plus 22 to diplomacy and prep time.
Now regrets not fighting Baba Yaga's chicken hut with a mech in the last time.
That could have been a mech combat. You could definitely set
totally
out the chicken
could do
hut
that.
you as a mech opponent in Starfinder Mecha
She
rules.
could totally mount magical laser cannons on her.
By the time it got to the future, she probably did. Let's be honest.
Yeah, let's be real. Like, she would totally have, like, laser cannons, and then it's, like, not just laser cannons, but they also curse you terribly if they hit, and the wound shall never heal, or something like that.
Uplifted chicken legs.
Yes.
Each of the chicken legs was uplifted and now has intelligence, and they've been learning witchcraft just by watching Baba Yaga do stuff.
And so they blast spells out of their talons as they move too.
That's right. So they're uplifted witch chicken legs that are on the mecha hut that is attacking people. I could absolutely see that.
Now I'm wondering if the legs are even what it's walking on anymore. If the legs, or if it's like walking on mech legs, and then the chicken talons are kind of like arms that are just like, Pwah! Yeah.
Yep. So basically, I guess what we're saying here is it's cool to use the vehicles, but you kind of want to use vehicles in a meta that also has vehicles or other things that are at about the same range as vehicles. Even Pathfinder 2 tries to put in some rules that let you use vehicles otherwise, but ultimately on many of the maps you're going to want to use them for. They don't work great, and the result could be just like basically akin to a drive-by shooting, where you just kind of drive by, shoot at a penalty, and then keep driving past, and the enemies are just like, well, they're hundreds of feet away from us now. Fortunately, many of the low-level vehicles in Pathfinder 2 are slow. They're not very fast. This prevents this issue and allows them to be more usable. But once you get to some of the higher level and faster ones, and if you have your driver be like, go, maximum speed, then you wind up at that.
Well, I think, too, you also often have combats taking place in areas that aren't like wide open fields, right? And so they're not necessarily as well suited.
Yeah, but the problem with that is then you kind of can't use the vehicles in some cases because they go kind of straight and you have to turn them, and it's like, watch out for that! Oh, wall.
Yeah, but what I'm saying though is that like there are a lot of areas that naturally wouldn't necessarily allow them in them. So it's not necessarily difficult to like find adventures that have reasons why you wouldn't necessarily take the vehicle in them. But if you want to have the vehicle,
problem is that we're assuming in this episode that you want to use the vehicle and have fun with the vehicle.
So you're probably then going to be in a place that is more designed for that. So a place where those vehicles are really going to shine. So you might have like, you could totally have like a chariot tournament.
Yep.
Or you could have like, a battle that takes place on a road where people have vehicles, or a battle, or, like a mecha battle, or like a fight that takes place at sea where people can move around freely.
The main point is, if, like we've said multiple times now at this point, if you have vehicles, the opponents either should have vehicles or some vehicle-esque scale thing if you really want to have parity.
Yeah, like, for example, like, if the PCs are, like, fighting a dragon that has ridiculous mobility, like, it's fine for them to have...
Even most of the vehicles in Pathfinder 2 are not fast enough to even be as fast as a dragon.
So maybe you have an adventure where the PCs are like, we want to fight a dragon, but we can't catch up to the dragon, so we're going to have, like, this magical flying ship, and we're going to need to, like, repair it as we're going along because the dragon's attacking us, but this is going to let us keep up.
That's a great use for the vehicle. So you want to find parity, because if you don't find parity and the PCs are on a 120-foot speed vehicle and the opponents are on foot, and you're in, like you said, Linda, it's either an area where you can't use the vehicles, in which case then you're sad because you want to use the vehicles, or you can use the vehicles and you're just going way past them. Not only that, it means that if everybody's not on board with that strategy, whoever is on the vehicle is like out of the fight for a little while as they turn around. If everyone is on the vehicle, then the enemies don't do anything. They have to wait and just like ready in action to try to shoot the vehicle as it comes whizzing past them or something like that.
But one of the interesting things that you can do with vehicles too is sort of like when the vehicles come together, when they meet and when they come apart, the sort of like boarding, having opportunities where boarding can happen, and then cases where things move farther away to change because then you can change the location of aspects of the battlefield relative to each other. Like if you're like on a train and you're gonna try to like, one of the things you're gonna try to do is shove your opponents onto the back cart and then like cut cut that car off, and then that car stops, and then they can't keep up with you or what have you.
Think about everything you've seen in movies and TV shows and things like that involving vehicles, and you can tell any of those kind of stories. But you probably have not really seen almost anything that was like an interesting fight scene in those movies and TV shows that was like some people were on vehicles and other people just couldn't keep up and were just being attacked.
Yeah.
So that's why you want to use all those examples and have fun with vehicles. Don't take away vehicles, but also, I mean, other than there's some places where it doesn't make sense. But like, if your PCs love vehicles, don't make 90% of the areas ones where you can't use them. But also, don't make opponents who can't handle the vehicles be a major feature, because those are not interesting fight scenes for people to enjoy.
Another thing to consider, though, is when ejection from a vehicle is a possibility, for the purposes of that combat, because the vehicle is moving so fast, that's kind of like the character died.
Yes, they're at least out of the fight. It's like they surrendered or escaped,
or they're out of the fight. Like, you know, if your character fell off the train, you know, and they tumbled and they didn't like die from the impact or whatever, they're not catching up to that, or like they. You know, if things are moving at full speed, you know, unless you have very strange things that are going on. So keep that in mind with the possibility, just as the PCs can hard defeat someone by removing them from the vehicle, so too can the opponents, especially if you're doing something where falling off is really bad. Like, you know, let's say that you're like in a magical ship that's floating along a river of magma, and if you fall off, then you fall into the magma, and you know, there's a whole product about that. What happens if you fall in lava and you die?
That's true.
Or like you're in an airship and you might fall off of that. So if the PCs are in a vehicle for which like falling off is really dangerous, it's also worth considering what kind of precautions might they have against like being completely destroyed if they're knocked off. You know, it wouldn't be so uncommon for them to say, okay, yeah, you know, we're in a ship. We're at least going to make sure our folks can swim, you know. We're in an airship. We're going to make sure that we've got, like, feather fall or fly or something that we can do to make sure that, like, in the worst case scenario, we're not completely... I'm seeing a note here, seatbelt OP, please nerf.
Mm-hmm.
Which also gets to, like, what happens if the transport is destroyed, because certainly things like, you know, you're on a sinking ship, or, like, the lights in your starship are blinking red because there's a critical system failure, things like that.
Danger!
So in a lot of cases with those sorts of things, what you might have is either you have a scene where you're needing to evacuate, or more commonly you have something where you need to like pull things together while also doing the combat, or like prevent the issue with the skill challenge or things like that. Yes, red alarm.
And Rohit wonders, does the problem of vehicles getting destroyed get worse at higher levels? In theory, it does and it doesn't. So if the vehicles are themselves very low-level vehicles, then they could possibly get destroyed by collateral damage very quickly. Mm-hmm. But high-level characters have more abilities that might allow them to actually keep up with vehicles, so that they're not actually out of the fight as much as they would have been before those vehicles. Like, if you have something like the Dragon Form Polymorph spell, or the feat from the Dragon Ancestry to supercharge your fly speed, or you're just like a high-level monk or swashbuckler, you might be able to actually kind of catch back up in a way that people didn't expect, or maybe with the Furious Sprint feat from Barbarian. So, there are ways to get around it at higher levels, but it is true that if you're using a low-level vehicle and it's just like, well, a meteor swarm happened and my vehicle was not high enough level to survive a meteor swarm, that it will happen more often at higher levels unless you have, like, some ridiculous vehicle. So, you want to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and how are the PCs going to be able to fix it? You know, is it... If the PCs invested a lot of resources, like, if the PCs have... Sometimes you're just going to be like, oh yeah, you know, we've bought passage on the ship. We're the caravan guards for this caravan, or we're like, you know, and we're not necessarily invested in this vehicle so much. But if the PCs have something and they're like, this is our ship, or like this is our, you know, this is our caravan, or this is our train, or this is our thing, then like that getting damaged and threatened can impact things almost in the same way as one of their characters having that happen to them. You know, because it represents, you know, it almost becomes a character in the story that they have, and that they've also invested a lot of money into in many cases. It's like, oh yeah, you know, So, and if it breaks, they're gonna be like, oh my gosh. So you want to make sure there's like some way for them to fix things up and get it back. But that also starts. I'm thinking about like Skull and Shackles here too. You know, the PCs aren't necessarily the friendly ones who are having a transport that is attacked by miscreants or helping defend things. They might be pirates or somebody else who is trying to take control of the vehicles.
Vehicle damage was not a major thing in our Skull and Shackles game, and that's
true.
because I thought, Captain Rin had a policy that our ship should not get hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And since all of our ships, we had a fleet of ships, and our ships also include any ships that we come across.
Yes, that's correct.
Those are also our ships.
So you shouldn't
They should not get damaged.
Even just because the captain on board is laboring under the mistaken notion that this ship has not been turned over to your possession doesn't mean it's not your ship.
And so if we just damage and sink our own ships, then how are we going to be able to sell these ships or use them to increase our fleet for our ships? Like, who would do that? It's a self-inflicted wound.
Yes.
And that way we didn't have to worry about the fact that our characters especially since we had a kineticist who was a water kineticist and really could have screwed around with opponent's ships. We didn't have to worry about the fact that we could have done that because we instead would always sneak on board.
Piracy plus water kineticists control water to create like a dip that the ship was stuck in so you could come up to it.
Sneak on board and then defeat the opposing captain.
Sneak on board, defeat the opposing captain, convince as many of the other people as you can to...
Challenge the captain to a duel while everybody else on the ship probably attacked me anyway. And I'd be like, you're cheating in this duel. Anyone who surrenders will take you to the port of your choice and we will completely spare you. But if you just keep attacking, then that's not going to be good.
Mm-hmm.
And if the captain surrenders, all your unconscious people who didn't surrender yet count as surrendering. So it's extra incentive.
Yep.
Oh, piracy.
Oh, yes. But another thing that makes me think of is also like upgrading your vehicles can be a lot of fun rather than trading them in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, in Skull and Shackles, we upgraded the Andromeda to have, like, dark wood, and, like, some mithril plating, so that it would be super fast.
And, like, super upgraded, like, spider silk sails and all sorts of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be super fast and light and agile and things like that.
Yes. Our goal was to be fast enough that the opponents could not attack our ship with, our main ship, with their siege weapons, so that we could stay out of range of siege weapons as we boarded their ship and took control of it so that we didn't have to hurt... when I said their ship, I mean our ship that they were on.
Siege weapons. That hits on something else that I wanted to talk about with vehicles, is that siege weapons are something that you're definitely going to be dealing with some larger weapons. These kinds of weaponry that are, ridiculously damaging and are designed for damaging giant things, like, you know, just like starship weapons are gonna be like
they do hull point damage.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, you know, if you use like a capital class starship weapon against like anything that's not a starship, then it's gonna have a really bad time.
Yes, and no matter how strong your soldier is, if you take your Dashko and slash in a capital class starship, you're not gonna do very much.
Yeah. So you you have those, and then you're also in that case going to have things that are going to rely a lot more on collaboration. So whether that's like, you know, starship combat where everybody's got their different roles that they're doing to put together, or whether that's like, you know, you're all aboard a ship or like a Trojan horse or like a siege tower or something like that, and then you're working together to fight things. So
what if it's a giant wooden rabbit?
It could be.
Or badger.
It could be. So you're often going to have like a lot of participants in that combat. That also, another thing that you're likely to run into is for large transports might be situations where you've got a lot of NPCs who may not necessarily be as strong. So I would highly recommend considering things like using troops to represent like a large group of It's like, instead of being like, ah, yes, I'm going to roll 40 sailors into this combat, be like, sailor troop. This represents the rank and file sailors who are aboard this ship.
Mm-hmm. So Rohit asked a really good question, which is, with long distance vehicles and transportations, what do you do if PCs go to a place you didn't expect them to go because they had so much transportation access and they just suddenly went somewhere else?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This really comes into play too with especially with teleportation and things like that, where it's just like, oh yeah, we can't go anywhere. But any kind of long distance vehicle, if the players, if there's a map of the world and they know the setting and things like that, they may just kind of choose to go to a place. I think that, it gets into kind of like, well, why did they want to go to that place? Are they going there because they think it's cool? Are they going there because they want to do an adventure there? Or are they going there because they want to gather some kind of a resource? They want to purchase something. They want to study under the fabled sage to help learn more spells or things like that.
Are they doing it just like to troll you or the setting? Because that's a different story
that's
than any
story,
of what Linda said. If they're like, let's go to Mediogalti Island and crush some mantises while shouting out, here Jackie, 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 here Jackie, Jackie, Jackie. Then,
also, we're level 5.
also, we're level 5. Then they're, it's gonna.
Then they've asked. They're like, why do you want to TPK?
It's like a very different story than if they were just like, yeah, we want to go to Katapesh because you can buy anything there, and then we're gonna buy something there.
Yeah, so I'd say like step 1 is like figure out why they want to go there.
Mm-hmm.
And then see if you can
Dustin
make something.
Says page 47 of my approved backstory shows that I know 3 people in that port.
Yeah, so maybe they want to follow up on a backstory hook.
That was my Kingmaker
we got
PC.
out of focus?
Oh no, we lost focus and we're blurry. Let me put my hand up on this. How about now? Wait, did it make us light and focused?
For a moment. And
okay,
then we got
we're focused now.
Alright.
So that was my Kingmaker character who had the backstory where he wound up like bouncing from academy to study abroad, and that's how he wasn't killed when the rest of his family were killed by the Surtovas.
Mm-hmm.
And it also meant that when we did need to teleport somewhere, that he had been in a number of different places that had bardic schools, like the Kitharodian Academy in Opara. But so, like, yeah, sometimes you do know some people in that
so
course.
I think, though, like, it's most likely to be a challenge for the GM if it's not just like, hey, they want to do a little side story in this location, but it's something about that location is fundamentally disruptive to the plot that I'm doing. Like, let's say that you had a plot that was about, like, trying to figure out some kind of a solution to like a curse that is plaguing a particular area.
And they teleport to a place with a 17th level cleric.
And they teleport to a place with a 17th level cleric, right? So there's a few ways you can go about this. If it's a 17th level cleric, like they probably have a lot of things on their plate and they don't necessarily have time to like be casting spells for anyone who would possibly want them to be casting spells.
What if the PCs are willing to pay 10 times the usual rate?
If the PCs are willing to pay 10 times the usual rate? Well, I mean, I guess that's kind of like solving the problem by like the GP tossing the thing, and then you didn't necessarily make profit from that solution, but you still did it. I mean, like, because sometimes like they can just win by doing the unconventional solution you didn't think of. But like if you're having a problem with like you're having trouble building story structures because they're always finding these kinds of solutions, that probably means that you're telling stories that don't jive with the level of transportation that the PCs have access to. You're telling stories that are meant for we stay close to our small town, but you have a party that has the ability to travel nationally or transnationally.
Or transdimensionally. Or transplanetarily.
Yeah. And so then if you would want to tell those kinds of stories, you'd need to introduce reasons why they don't have access to those resources. And, you wouldn't want to make it feel like you're saying, oh, well, you're winning too much, so this is punitive or whatever. But you might have situations where usually you have access to those kinds of resources, but then, you're doing an adventure in a demiplane, and you can't escape that demiplane until you do some other thing, and so therefore resources are less. And for PCs who are used to having a high degree of mobility and resources, those kinds of adventures can really feel like they have much higher stakes. And then when they get to the other side of that and they're like, okay, we've got all our stuff again. Now we're going to sell our other things. We're going to buy stuff because we can go back to any port again. And for a while we were doing this sort of thing. So if you're
wondering why like there were like so many early Paizo APs where like book 5 or 4, somewhere around there, you would go in a demi-plane where you can't get out of the demi-plane and you can't do any of those things. I think it's for a very similar reason to this. Where it shook things up a little bit in terms of resources.
Yeah, it does.
So I would say that's our answer to the question from Rohit, and it was a good question about long-distance transportation and how it can sort of throw off your expectations. Now, if your game is completely a sandbox of just like the players do whatever and you roll it sort of reactively, maybe you don't mind at all, and it's just like, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, and that changes things up, and they're gonna have some adventures over here, and then, but I mean, it could be the case, generally the case that like, you know, if you started things in Nation A and you have like things building up and you've had signs of things going on that the stakes are rising in this area, and then they go and they do things in Nation B for a while, you know, maybe then rumors will reach them that things have gotten worse in Nation A because they haven't been there in months. And so they didn't do the things that they, you know, that your adventurer may have expected that they would do, and then they can decide, oh, do we want to go back and fix that, or we're like, no, we're over here invested in what's going on with Nation B, or we want to do something else. So you can still have things in the plot continue to move forward.
Yep. So, and Dustin says in his firefighting campaign, they did a lot of chases and races, but at a higher level, with the driver PC missing sessions, it's calmed down and focused on other stuff.
Chases and races are cool.
Yep. So I think that's about what I wanted to say in terms of transportation and vehicles.
Sounds good.
How about you, Linda?
Yeah. Shall we say goodbye to YouTube?
Bye, YouTube. See
Bye.
you on Saturday, which will not be Saturday for you.